The road leading to the hotel was nothing more than a narrow, winding path, swallowed by the dense forest that surrounded me on all sides. As I drove deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, blocking out the fading light of the evening. The GPS had lost its signal miles ago, leaving me to rely on the vague directions I had scribbled down. A sense of unease settled in my chest, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. When I finally spotted the hotel, it felt like a mirage. An old, decaying structure that had no business standing in such a remote place. The building was tall and narrow, its facade crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out at the wilderness. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sound of my tires crunching against the stones seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Stepping out of the car, I was immediately struck by how still everything was. Not a breath of wind, not a rustle in the leaves, just an eerie, suffocating quiet that wrapped around me like a shroud. The only movement came from the flickering light above the entrance, which cast long, wavering shadows across the front of the hotel. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but there was nowhere else to go. The nearest town was hours away, and night was closing in fast. Inside, the hotel was no less unsettling. The lobby was dimly lit, the only light coming from a pair of tarnished chandeliers that swung slightly, though there was no breeze. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I approached the front desk, the sound echoing down the long, empty hallways that branched off from the lobby. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one in sight. The receptionist appeared almost out of nowhere, his arrival so silent and sudden that I nearly jumped. He was an older man, tall and thin, with skin that looked as though it hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were sunken and dull, and when he smiled, it didn't reach them. He spoke in a low, monotone voice, barely more than a whisper, as if afraid of disturbing the silence that enveloped the hotel. "Welcome," he said, sliding an old-fashioned ledger across the counter for me to sign. His fingers were long and bony, the nails yellowed and cracked. I tried not to stare, focusing instead on the pen in my hand. The ink was thick and black, leaving an almost oily trail on the paper. After I signed my name, the receptionist handed me a small, tarnished key attached to a leather tag. The number on the tag was faded, but I could just make out the number 13. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I dismissed it as nothing more than superstition. Just as I turned to head up to my room, the receptionist held up a bony finger, stopping me in my tracks. "Wait," he said, his voice even quieter now if that was possible. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "You'll need this." I took the note from him, my fingers brushing against his cold, clammy skin. Unfolding it, I saw 5 lines of neat, cramped handwriting, listing out 5 rules. The first rule read, "Do not leave your room after midnight." The rest were equally bizarre, each one more cryptic than the last. "What is this?" I asked, glancing up at the receptionist, who was now watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Rules," he said simply, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Follow them if you want to survive the night." I let out a nervous laugh, but the sound died in my throat when I saw that he wasn't joking. His expression remained stone-faced, those dull eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. "Survive the night?" I repeated, trying to inject some humor into my tone, but it fell flat. The receptionist said nothing, just stared at me with that same unsettling intensity. Realizing I wasn't going to get any answers, I folded the note and shoved it into my pocket, giving a forced nod before hurrying away. As I walked down the narrow hallway, the walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and darker with each step. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the darkness. By the time I reached room 13, my nerves were frayed. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking as I tried to fit it into the lock. When the door finally creaked open, I practically threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of my heart. It was just a prank, I told myself, nothing more. Some local legend to scare tourists. But as I pulled the crumpled note from my pocket and read those rules again, a cold dread began to settle in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something far more sinister than I had bargained for. I hadn't meant to break the rule. Not really. But as the minutes crept past midnight, curiosity began to gnaw at me, eroding my resolve. The silence in the room was oppressive, thick like a blanket that smothered every sound. My heartbeats felt amplified in the quiet, each thump a loud reminder of how alone I was in this ancient, decaying hotel. At first, I tried to distract myself, flipping through the few channels on the old television, scrolling through my phone even though there was no signal. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the silence became, until it was all I could hear. My eyes kept drifting to the note on the nightstand, the words etched into my mind like a haunting melody. Do not leave your room after midnight. It was a ridiculous rule, wasn't it? Just some old superstition or a way to add to the eerie atmosphere of the hotel. Yet, the memory of the receptionist's cold, lifeless eyes and the way he had spoken those words sent a chill down my spine. But I wasn't a child. I wasn't going to let some silly note dictate my actions. Then came the noise, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a product of my strained nerves. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was a soft tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming on wood, coming from somewhere beyond the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat up, straining to listen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, growing more insistent by the second. A part of me wanted to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head like a scared child and wait until morning. But another part, the part that was more curious than afraid, pushed me to investigate. Maybe it was just an old pipe or a loose shutter. There had to be a rational explanation. I slid out of bed, my bare feet making no sound on the worn carpet. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, the metal cold against my skin. For a moment, I considered going back to bed, but the tapping continued, echoing in the stillness of the night. Swallowing my fear, I slowly turned the knob and opened the door just enough to peek into the hallway. The corridor was dark, illuminated only by the weak, flickering light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I stepped into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar behind me. The air was colder out here, the chill seeping into my bones. I looked down both ends of the hallway, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. Everything was still, eerily so. The tapping had sounded so close, but now there was nothing, just the darkness stretching out in both directions. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, the old floorboards groaning under my weight. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, like someone calling my name. My breath hitched, and I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, soft and teasing, floating through the air like a ghostly echo. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it sounded close, too close. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I found myself following the sound, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. My footsteps were slow, cautious, as I crept down the hallway, the shadows shifting around me. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but still, I couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I reached the end of the hallway, where the corridor branched off in two directions. The whisper had stopped, replaced by that same oppressive silence. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, what I was feeling. But before I could turn back, something caught my eye, a fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision, darting across the far end of the corridor. I whipped my head around, my pulse racing, but the hallway was empty. My skin prickled with a cold sweat as I took a step back, my back pressing against the wall. The shadow had been there, I was sure of it. But now there was nothing, just the endless dark. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as I realized the mistake I had made. I shouldn't have left my room. I should have listened. I should have followed the rules. Panic clawed at my throat as I turned and bolted back down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor. The hotel seemed to come alive around me, the walls creaking, the shadows lengthening as if trying to reach out and grab me. The whispers returned, louder now, almost mocking, but I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting back to my room, back to safety. When I reached the door, I nearly slammed into it in my haste to get inside. My hands fumbled with the knob, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it wouldn't turn, that I was trapped outside in the dark. But finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled into the room, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my heart racing out of control. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. My hands were shaking as I locked the door, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. Whatever that was out there, it wasn't natural. It wasn't human, and it wanted me to know that I had broken the rule. I collapsed onto the bed, the crumpled note digging into my side as I pulled the covers over myself, trying to block out the terror that clawed at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking just beyond the door, waiting for me to slip up again. The rules weren't just warnings. They were survival, and now I knew I had to follow them if I wanted to make it through the night. After the first encounter, I told myself I wouldn't break another rule. I even made a vow, clutching that crumpled note as if it were a lifeline. But the night had a way of warping your thoughts, of twisting your fears and curiosities into something unrecognizable. The darkness outside the window felt alive, pressing against the glass, whispering my name, daring me to challenge the boundaries I had set. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every groan of the old hotel seemed magnified in the silence. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. And then there was the door, the one I had seen at the far end of the hallway, the one I had purposefully avoided when I ventured out earlier. The note had been explicit. Do not open the door at the end of the hallway. I'd assumed it was just another odd quirk of this bizarre place. But now, lying in bed with my heart still pounding from the earlier terror, I couldn't get that door out of my mind. It was like a dark presence, a weight that pressed down on me, pulling me toward it. My rational mind screamed at me to stay put, to wait out the night in the relative safety of my room. But another part, a darker, more reckless part, urged me to find out what lay behind that door. What could be so dangerous that it warranted a rule of its own? Before I knew it, I was on my feet, moving toward the door of my room as if in a trance. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. I hesitated, trying to summon the willpower to turn back, but the compulsion was too strong. I had to know. I needed to see what was on the other side. The hallway was as dark and silent as before, but this time, the shadows felt thicker, more oppressive. My footsteps were muffled by the carpet, the sound swallowed by the eerie stillness. The door at the end of the hallway loomed closer with each step, its presence almost palpable. The air grew colder, a chill that sank into my bones and made me shiver. When I reached the door, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, as though it were alive, waiting for me to make a move. The wood was dark and smooth, unlike the rest of the hotel, which was worn and decaying. There was something unsettlingly pristine about it, something that set my teeth on edge. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, my skin prickling with the instinctive knowledge that I was about to make a terrible mistake. But the curiosity, that relentless need to know, overpowered my fear. The knob was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. I twisted it slowly, the metal creaking in protest, but it turned easily enough. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a low groan, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow all light. I hesitated on the threshold, a wave of nausea washing over me as the air from the room hit me. Stale, musty, with an underlying scent of something rotten. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The room was vast, far larger than I had anticipated, and filled with an unsettling dimness that made it hard to see clearly. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes. Pieces of old, broken furniture scattered haphazardly across the floor. A cracked mirror leaned against one wall, its surface smeared with something dark and sticky. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, disturbed only by what looked like drag marks leading toward the far corner of the room. As I moved deeper into the space, the air grew thicker, almost chokingly so. My footsteps stirred up clouds of dust, and every breath tasted of decay. I could barely make out the outlines of things, but what I saw filled me with a growing sense of dread. An old, tattered armchair sat near the center, its fabric stained with dark, rust-colored patches. A broken table lay nearby, one of its legs splintered and covered in what looked like dried blood. And then I saw it. A large, ornate mirror, its surface rippling like water, even though there was no breeze. The frame was intricately carved, depicting twisted figures that seemed to writhe and contort as I stared at them. But it was the reflection that held me captive, that sent a bolt of cold terror straight through me. In the mirror, I didn't see the room behind me. Instead, I saw something else, another place entirely. A dark, desolate landscape, twisted and wrong, where the sky bled red and the ground was black and scorched. Shadows moved within the reflection, not human, but something else, something monstrous and hungry. They slithered and crawled, writhing across the cracked earth, their eyeless faces turning toward me as if they could sense my presence. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the mirror had a hold on me, pulling me in, dragging me toward that nightmarish world. My reflection in the glass wasn't my own anymore. It was distorted, twisted, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, silently screaming. Suddenly, the shadows in the mirror surged forward, their forms becoming clearer, more defined. They were coming for me, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers, their mouths opening in silent, hungry snarls. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the pull of the mirror growing stronger, dragging me closer to that hellish place. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched myself free from whatever force was holding me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the debris on the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The mirror seemed to tremble, the figures within it clawing at the surface as if trying to break through. I could feel their hunger, their desperate need to escape, to drag me back with them. Without thinking, I turned and ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears as I fled the room. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I didn't stop running until I was back in the safety of my own room, the lock clicking into place with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. I collapsed against the door, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I had just seen, what I had just barely escaped. The image of that mirror, of the things inside it, was burned into my mind, and I knew I would never forget it. I had broken the second rule, and I had barely escaped with my sanity intact. But now, there was no denying it. This hotel was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And the rules were not just suggestions. They were the only thing standing between me and the horrors that lurked within these walls. I couldn't stay here any longer. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to escape this nightmare before it swallowed me whole. The terror I had felt since arriving at this accursed hotel had grown into something monstrous, an all-consuming fear that gnawed at my sanity. The rules no longer mattered. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. The third rule flashed in my mind. Do not attempt to leave before dawn. But what choice did I have? Staying meant facing whatever malevolent force haunted this place, and I wasn't sure I could survive another encounter. I grabbed my bag with trembling hands, throwing open the door and stepping into the hallway with a determination that bordered on desperation. The hotel was deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating and unnatural. The shadows seemed to deepen as I walked, every corner hiding something unseen, something waiting. But I forced myself to keep going, each step heavier than the last, as if the hotel itself were trying to hold me back. The lobby was just as I had left it, the same dim lighting casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The receptionist's desk was empty, the bell sitting ominously in the center, untouched. The front door was just ahead, the only thing standing between me and freedom. But when I reached it and turned the handle, I felt a sinking dread settle in my stomach. The door wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, my breath quickening as panic set in. It was as if the door had fused with the frame, an immovable barrier between me and the outside world. I rattled the handle violently, kicking at the door, but it was no use. I was trapped. I turned back, intent on finding another way out, but the hotel had changed. The lobby was no longer the open space I had entered. The walls seemed to have closed in, and the corridor that should have led to the other side of the building was gone. In its place was a narrow, twisting hallway that hadn't been there before. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled forward, the walls closing in on me. Every door I passed was locked, and the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in impossible ways. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was alive, that it was actively working against me, warping reality to keep me inside. I turned a corner and found myself back at the lobby, the front door looming ahead. My breath hitched. I had just left this place. How had I ended up back here? I spun around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but the hotel was a maze, and I was lost in its ever-shifting corridors. The walls began to close in, and the air grew thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding. The shadows danced at the edges of my vision, flickering and writhing like living things. I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, floating through the air, growing louder with each passing moment. As I stumbled down yet another corridor, my mind began to play tricks on me. The walls seemed to pulse, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark, rotting wood beneath. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, echoing in the empty hallway, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out words now, taunting, mocking. "You'll never leave." I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I searched for any exit, any way out of this nightmare. But every turn led me back to where I started, the hotel shifting and twisting around me, trapping me in its endless labyrinth. I could feel my sanity slipping, the walls pressing in, the whispers growing louder, more menacing. And then I saw them. Apparitions, flickering in and out of existence, shadows of the people who had come before me. Their faces were pale and twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and empty. They reached out to me with skeletal hands, their mouths moving soundlessly, as if begging for help that would never come. I backed away, my mind reeling, but there was nowhere to go. The hotel had become a living nightmare, a prison with no escape. Time itself seemed to warp, the minutes stretching into hours, the hours into an eternity. I could no longer tell how long I had been wandering these halls, trapped in this endless cycle of terror. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, the shadows closing in around me. My vision blurred, and I could feel myself slipping, my mind unraveling as the hotel's horrors consumed me. The walls twisted and distorted, and I could see faces in the wallpaper, their eyes watching me, their mouths curled into sinister smiles. I was losing myself, becoming just another lost soul trapped within the hotel's cursed walls. The front door loomed ahead once more, but I knew it was futile. There was no escape. The hotel had me, and it wasn't going to let me go. As I collapsed to the floor, the last remnants of my sanity slipping away, I realized the terrible truth. The hotel had never intended for me to leave. It had lured me in, ensnared me with its twisted rules, and now I was a part of it. Another ghost, another whisper in the dark, forever trapped in its endless corridors. And as the darkness closed in, I could only scream, knowing that no one would ever hear me. I was barely holding on. The weight of the night's horrors had crushed any semblance of rational thought, leaving me a shell of the person who had walked into this cursed place. My mind was fraying, unraveling at the edges, but one thought, one final shred of hope, kept me going. The last rule: survive until dawn and you may leave. The words echoed in my mind, a lifeline in the dark, a promise that if I could just endure a few more hours, I might still escape. I stumbled back to my room, my legs barely supporting me, each step feeling like I was dragging a ton of bricks. The hotel was no longer twisting and shifting, but the silence that had returned was far more oppressive. It was the silence of something watching, waiting, eager to see if I would make it through the night. When I reached my room, I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The sense of being trapped, of having no control, gnawed at me, but I had no choice. The rules were clear. I had to stay, to survive the torment, and see the dawn. I pushed the dresser in front of the door, a futile attempt at creating a barrier, something to keep the horrors at bay, even if just for a little while. I collapsed onto the bed, my body and mind exhausted, every nerve frayed and on edge. The room seemed to close in around me, the darkness thick and suffocating. The whispers had returned, faint and insidious, creeping into my thoughts, poisoning my mind. But I clung to that final rule like a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood, refusing to let go. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the memories of what I had seen replayed in vivid detail, each more horrifying than the last. The faces in the mirror, the twisted hallways, the endless doors. All of it circled in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. I was teetering on the edge, but I had to hold on. Dawn was coming, and with it, my chance at escape. But the hotel wasn't done with me yet. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became voices. Angry, hateful voices that filled the room, seeping through the walls, pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear footsteps outside the door, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the threshold, waiting for me to break. The air grew colder, a bone-deep chill that made my teeth chatter, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The walls began to pulse, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark, wet wood beneath. Faces appeared in the grain, their eyes hollow and filled with malice, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. They watched me, their expressions shifting between pity and mockery, as if they knew I wouldn't make it. But I had to. I had to survive. I repeated the rule over and over in my mind, a mantra that kept me anchored, kept me from slipping into the abyss. Survive until dawn and you may leave. I don't know how much time passed, but at some point, I became aware of a change in the air. The darkness outside the window was beginning to lift, the oppressive weight of the night slowly giving way to the first hints of dawn. The voices began to fade, the faces in the walls disappearing one by one, until only silence remained. I staggered to the window, my legs barely supporting me, and pulled back the heavy drapes. A faint light was creeping over the horizon, weak and pale, but unmistakably the light of dawn. Relief washed over me in a wave so intense that I nearly collapsed. I had made it. I had survived the night. I turned back to the room, my body shaking with exhaustion, but something caught my eye. The note, the one I had received upon check-in, was lying on the nightstand where I had left it, but now it looked different. The edges were frayed, the paper yellowed and brittle, as if it had aged overnight. I picked it up with trembling hands, and as I did, I noticed something else. There were other pieces of paper tucked beneath the nightstand, crumpled and faded, half hidden as if someone had tried to hide them. I pulled them out, my heart pounding. They were notes just like mine, each one containing the same set of rules. Some were nearly illegible, the ink smeared and faded, while others were covered in frantic, scrawled handwriting. My stomach twisted as I realized what I was holding. These were the notes of previous guests, people who had come before me, who had received the same rules, and who had fought to survive just as I had. But they hadn't made it. Not all of them, at least. Some of the notes were incomplete, the final rule crossed out or missing entirely. Others had desperate messages scrawled across the margins. Pleas for help, warnings, even accusations of betrayal. My hands shook as I read through them, the horror of what they represented sinking in. The hotel had been doing this for years, maybe decades, trapping people in its twisted game, forcing them to survive or perish. And now I was part of that history. I dropped the notes, my mind reeling. I had survived, but at what cost? The hotel had let me go, but it had taken something from me. My sanity, my peace of mind, my very soul. I would never be the same. The horrors I had witnessed, the terror I had endured, would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I left the room, the hotel was eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. The front door opened easily, and I stepped out into the cold morning air, the weight of the night's events pressing down on me. I looked back at the hotel, its dark windows staring back like empty eyes, and a shiver ran down my spine. I had survived, but the hotel had won. It had taken a piece of me, and I knew that it would never let me forget. And as I walked away, the final twist of the knife sank in. I was just one of many, one more soul to be added to the hotel's collection, and it would wait patiently for the next guest to arrive, the next victim to be ensnared in its web of terror. I was free, but I would never truly escape.